Hello, my name is Paul Wehman from Virginia Commonwealth University, and it's my pleasure to talk a little bit about customized employment and support employment, and specifically how effective they've been and their impact, and even more so, some of the confusion that has gone on in really too many years about what each employment model which are predominantly used for people with developmental disabilities, um, has been about, and so that's what this fairly short webinar will be about. So, for a long time, support employment was the primary way that services were being delivered for people with significant challenges to get into the competitive workforce. And support employment in and of itself is a paradigm shift because it basically was all about individuals with uh, disabilities who normally would be getting all of their training done in a day program or a special center, was being done in a business where they were hired. And then an employment specialist or a job coach would be working directly with them. So next slide. And this whole concept of supported employment started um, in the early 1980s. Uh, our team here at Virginia Commonwealth University and um, some of the folks up in Vermont and clearly Seattle, Ellensburg, Washington State, Oregon, clearly we're all part of trying to figure out a way to help people with significant disabilities get real work for real pay. And the whole concept was to have um, a staff person that was trained in usually systematic instruction and um, applied behavior analysis in order to increase productivity and reduce behavior issues, um, and get the person to be more competent and capable at the competitive work site. And that all got into the law in 1986. So support employment has been around for a while. Then in the early 2000s, customized employment began, and it actually started through initiatives at the U.S. Department of Labor by some forward-thinking people, individuals, well, certainly like Chris Button, who still works in the Office of Disability Employment Policy, and then persons like Michael Callahan and Kerry Griffin, the latter two, who have retired. But the thought process was that support employment was not individualized enough, and that there was not enough customization, I guess is the best way to say it. And it became um, part of the new Rehab Act law called Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, WIOA, and it was passed by Congress, and also along with support employment became an employment model that could be used. Okay. Now, unfortunately, there are a significant number of similarities between both these models. And while the two models both have their own degree of success and efficacy, support employment had been active for close to 20 years before customized employment came on. And There is, as you'll see when we go through it, quite a bit of overlap, which has caused confusion between new people who are coming into the field, and they're hearing terms called customized employment, and then some of the older or more experienced people are saying, well, we do that in support employment anyways. So there's some truth there, and there's some confusion and um, I hesitate to say untruth, but frankly, there's just confusion. All right. And, the leading group in support employment, APSE, has uh, had to navigate issues with a number of their membership that has been uh, pro support employment for a long time, not necessarily anti customized employment at all. But then the customized employment people are like, well, this is different, completely different than support employment, when it really isn't. And so, when in doubt, I think you have to really um, turn to the research, which is kind of what uh, I did. I talked with a number of people, and I was encouraged to write an editorial that was published in the um, May June issue of 2023 of the Journal of Vocational Rehabilitation. You can find that if you're an APSE member easily enough. But if you're not, this webinar will cover a lot of that because it's totally based on that editorial that I wrote. Okay. So let's start with what are the key aspects of supported employment. SE does provide a way for individuals with significant disabilities, predominantly cognitive disabilities, to participate in competitive employment rather than be in long-term segregated situations. Key aspect was to not hold somebody forever in a day program and hope they're going to learn enough there to get a real job, but instead place them quickly and depend on the job coach to do a lot of the training while the person's employed. And surprisingly enough, we found in the 80s that employers were actually quite supportive of that. The training has to be done with daily monitoring until the competence and success are achieved. And we've been able to track the hours at VCU in Richmond, and we know now which populations will take more hours and where some of the bumps are along the way. And then the assumption is that most of these individuals that you're working with would need long-term support anyhow. So as they become more competent at work, we still feel that periodic visits are necessary, and we need to stay in touch with the first line supervisor or the people at the company to make sure that everything's working out fine. Okay. So what are the key aspects of customized employment? Well, customized employment clearly came about because it places more emphasis on the client's interests and needs and aspirations, and somewhat more attention paid to the labor market and job analysis. Now, this is where the problem comes in, because you will get people in the support employment area that will say, oh, we pay attention to the client's interests. And we do job analysis significantly before we place somebody. But this is what we have to turn very carefully to the similarities and the differences of what some of the concepts are. The employment opportunity is clearly supposed to be customized to the worker's unique characteristics and interests, more so than support employment. Now, as we get through this, it's very important to approach this in a fair way, okay? Because if you're in the support employment camp, so to speak, you're going to think one way. If you're in the customized employment camp, you're going to think another way. When in fact, they overlap. Some do, CE does more of certain things than SE. And so we need to tease some of that out. And rather than, even though it was an editorial, my feeling as an empirical guy, a research-oriented guy, evidence-based research, was it really wasn't up to me to make a decision about whether one thing was better or the other. And in fact, as the editor of Journal of Voc Rehab, I've published probably more customized employment articles than any other journal, because I'm trying to be, even though we were part of starting support employment with others in the early 80s, late 70s, I really feel like it's important to be as fair as possible about, these two new models, to look at them from a research perspective and objectively. So that's what this editorial leads into further. Let's go ahead. So we're going to start looking at some of the key differences. And there are clearly some differences. And these differences under the questions are based on research studies. And there's a rather lengthy list of all the articles that are in that editorial, which was actually Journal of Voc Rehab, volume 59, 3, is what I believe it was. Okay. And it's actually in the same issue as the APSI 2022 proceedings. So if you want to get all the references there, you can catch them there. So the one difference is that support employment has had quite a bit of cost benefit data for implementation, and it clearly shows efficacy. There's been very little cost benefit analysis for customized employment, other than to say that there's a heavy emphasis on pre-placement, and it's quite a bit more time consuming, which means it's more expensive. The person that you would want to look up on cost benefit and support employment is a professor named Rob Cimera, Cimera, from Kent State University. And he's looked at the Rehab Service Administration 9/11 data to look at cost benefit data for support employment. So right now, the answer to that would be support employment has more cost benefit data for implementation. Okay. So support employment has been manualized, and there have been several books written about support employment by people like Keith Story, ourselves, others as well have done books. We wrote a very detailed manual right at the end of 1990s. We've updated it some, and we'll have a brand new version coming out. Well, it's being set, the printer is sending it right now. October should have a new Wehman et al. And there's 4 or 5 of us that have tried very hard to integrate some of the newest versions of support employment based on the research that is out there. There is no detailed manual that we are aware of for customized employment, although there are several fidelity scales that are available, where support employment does not have. It has some homemade checklists for good or bad, but it does not have a fidelity scale with discriminant validity, nor does CE for that matter, but it is a little further along in trying to identify the fidelity of the implementation. The only employment model that really has done a great job of that is the individual placement support system led by Bob Drake and Gary Bond and some of those folks with the mental health population. Okay. So some key differences. Supported employment provides for 4 distinct phases. Consumer choice, which would happen before a placement, find out what consumers want. Job development, trying to get the match of what the person likes with what the business needs. A heavy emphasis on job site training and intervention, and that can include rehab engineering, um, any of the supports that would be necessary for a person to be able to perform the job to the satisfaction of the employer, and then long-term follow along. Custom employment, especially if you speak with people like Mike Callahan, who really is a pioneer with customized employment, primarily presents much more under pre-placement activities. That whole area of studying intensely what the person likes or doesn't like, talking to family members, church, neighborhood, really doing a hard, deeper dive than person-centered planning, consumer choice for supported employment. That is labeled as discovery, DISCOVERY. And it is a very effective way, but it can be quite expensive and time consuming. Okay, go ahead. So around 2010 or 11, the United States Department of Justice decided to go into states that were completely segregated in terms of their sheltered workshops. And they used the Americans with Disabilities Act Title I unemployment as a justification. And a number of workshops now have been shut in the United States because these people come in from the Department of Justice. It goes to a federal court. You have a master. The most recent states were Oregon and North Carolina, I think. And the key point is this is not a research thing. It's more of a social validation of supported employment. But invariably, the treatment of choice by the U.S. Department of Justice for change for people when they leave the workshops has been to use supported employment, not customized employment. Okay. So as I see it, the key differences between SE and CE, other than the fact that SE, supported employment, has been around longer, is that there is an underlying value that rapid placement and not continued time in daycare programs or shelter workshops, which can last 15, 20, 30 years, is of greater value because it avoids longer segregation. Custom employment provides more greater in-depth analysis of the job seeker. And they also, the proponents of CE will say that they also will do a better job of informational interviewing of employers of what jobs might be possible. And that should be clearly considered as a difference because supported employment does do job site analysis, but that's available jobs. CE does a very, very nice job, and we'll talk about that in a bit more, of searching out for jobs that may not be even advertised, but the client, through this discovery process, would really do well in, and the employer would benefit from it. So that is a difference, but it's a good difference in the sense that we learn. You may have to spend more time in a segregated situation, but we're learning more about the two environments that could be helpful for a hard to place client. Okay. So I've mentioned this. Support employment does rapid engagement. So they're going to engage in jobs that are posted and listed as available that look like a good match based on consumer choice, where customized employment not only engages in those type of development activities, but also in job creation through employer information reviewing. And that is a very, in my opinion, powerful aspect that was not available typically in support employment. It's not to say that support employment job coaches or proponents haven't found jobs that weren't posted, but generally speaking, speed is a factor. Rehab is usually helping to fund that if it's not Medicaid waiver dollars. And where customized employment is also using rehab and Medicaid waiver dollars, but the rehab program is time limited, so it may take a lot of their money is being used before the person's actually even been placed. Okay. At this point, again, this is just a fact. There's really been no international testing that's been published that I'm aware of for customized employment. I'm sure that it's being used in some parts of the world, but for supported employment, it's really all over. South Africa, Japan, all over Australia, heavily in Ireland, Portugal, Spain, all of course, the Norway, Sweden, those states. And I know this because I see these papers that come in. We see as many as 125 to 150 papers a year to the Journal of Voc Rehab, and I'm not. I mean, hardly getting any customized employment research papers from outside of the U.S. It's only really a limited number that we've tried to publish them, but they generally do not have controls yet. Okay, go ahead. So we get to the bottom line. So what considerations can we use when assessing the interventions and considering the debates surrounding each? And I thought long and hard about this because, in my opinion, I don't really know. In fact, I'm pretty sure that that's the wrong question is to ask which is better. Okay. First of all, supported employment has been around for 20 years. Voc Rehab is heavily using it in their 110 placement program. And if you look at propensity score matching and logistic regression and hierarchical regression, you see that supported employment has quite a bit of efficacy, and it's been useful, or Voc Rehab wouldn't use it. But that doesn't mean that customized employment is bad. It means that supported employment has been used longer, and now we have a model that came in the early 2000s. But again, in fairness, neither of the two people who were doing the work along with the Department of Labor were with universities and had research infrastructure. And so they were doing their work through demonstrations. So I think that I think there's a few things that we should be asking, and it's not really which is better, because honestly, there are strengths in both. I think one question we should be asking is, and this is important, is which model is a better fit for which populations of people with disabilities, and how much severity of disability play a role in success. Because it's noteworthy to me that we see dozens, hundreds of articles, not necessarily well-controlled research studies, but for people with intellectual developmental disabilities. Clearly, the IPS is people with significant psychiatric disabilities. But then there's certain populations, um, for example, individuals who are um, struggling with very severe physical disabilities and they don't have good help, or people with very significant sensory disabilities and they don't have help. And you have to, if you're experienced in employment after a number of decades, you've got to ask yourself, well, maybe we're just not doing a good enough job of trying to figure out what things would match with these folks better, and we need to do that. So maybe the question is, which model's a better fit for which population? Go ahead. And along with that line, do we do ourselves a disservice when we're trying to compare one model to another when all we want is the same outcome, and that is competitive integrated employment? So there shouldn't be an argument about which is better when we want the same thing. And I don't think either of them are doing any damage. It's just a question of what's more efficient in terms of who it's matched to, because cost is a factor. You have to pay attention to cost, but you also have to pay attention to consumer choice. And also we have to try and get everybody a job, not just 80 or 90% that could do it through supported employment when they might be able to get a better job with customized employment. We just don't know that. Go ahead. So at the end of the day, I have to punt a little bit since it's football season. Do we just need to do a higher quality job of implementing not just support employment, custom employment, but customized employment, but also, the IPS model, okay, or models that will come along in the future to secure richer outcomes that also have greater sustainability, okay? I mean, it's one thing to say, okay, higher quality job. What do you mean by that? Well, richer outcome means more hours of work, more satisfaction by the worker and coworkers, and mostly the supervisor, better pay. And then greater sustainability, that means more hours of work, greater likelihood to access then benefits, and especially either staying on that job or advancing to a higher job, either in the same company or someplace else. And I think both those models, including all three, if you think IPS, I think they're all capable of doing that. But I don't think that as a field, we have translated the strength of any of these models that we're talking about to enough employment specialists and job coaches and managers of businesses and community rehab programs. We have not translated that information well enough so that we can get these richer outcomes with greater sustainability. So at the end of the day, go ahead. So while there are many differences, and there is more research evidence to support its efficacy, go ahead. And C does need to be manualized. It needs follow-along support activities. Both models need higher quality of service implementation. Go ahead. And we did this side by side just because there's been such confusion and discussion. We have to look at the research, and that's the reason for doing that. But go ahead. Now, there is more research that is demonstrating an efficacy on SE. and it's not necessarily being executed any better than CE, but at the end of the day, I think these efforts by the U.S. Rehab Service Administration to fund these sub-minimum wage disability innovation fund grants is going to turn out to be very helpful, because we'll be using supported employment and customized employment in order to be effective. And in fact, I have to say, I really wonder if the appropriate term is supported customized employment, and not just trying to pick one or the other, because the two do come together. And if you have to use, if you can do it with supported employment, then why take 3, 4, 5 times as long on customized employment if you can get rich outcomes and good durability, duration of work? But if you're struggling, then why wouldn't you go to customized employment as an option? So, you know, I have to wonder in the future whether we ultimately will, tie these two models together. Go ahead. So, kind of in closing here, so there's more research that demonstrates efficacy, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's being executed any better than CE, like we've been saying, perhaps in part due to lack of training, technical assistance. So, this is where we can find this this editorial. Okay, but I do want to close with, I want to leave you with, more than anything, that we need to do what we're doing better, and we need to match the models better, and maybe, if it's not heresy, we should seriously consider combining supported and customized employment into one, and we just use aspects of each model based on the population and what their needs are, as opposed to trying to compare them or generate more confusion for parents and policymakers who are trying to decide how much money to spend, etc. Well, thank you very much for your attention.